Hello, everybody. Good group. Good to be here with y'all tonight. And it's kind of nice that it's the Washburn lecture because I actually was a friend of Whit Washburn in the past, so I actually knew the guy, so kind of nice. Well, I'm an aging archaeologist, and I've been doing it for a long time. But when I was about the age of many of the students in this thing, I got really keenly interested in the idea of the environment and how humans impacted it. And when I first came to the Chesapeake Bay, I was really amazed by the potential to understand one of the most historic locations in all of America. And some of those questions are, what was the bay like in the past? How has it changed? What caused it to change, and when did those changes occur? I would like to address some of those questions in this next few minutes with a whirlwind tour through about 11,000 years of history. Let's go back to the very beginning, before there was a Chesapeake Bay, about 15,000 years ago. At that time, that gray area that you see off to the right was actually the coastline of the Atlantic. There was no Chesapeake Bay, but there were people here. Not too long ago, dredgers, about 45 miles off the coast of Ocean City, discovered mastodon bones and a human-shaped stone tool that clearly dates way before sea level rose to inundate that land. So there were people in this area centuries, even millennia before Chesapeake Bay. What did the Chesapeake Bay look like 15 or 12,000 years ago? Probably something like this. A very narrow river, forest-covered shores that was the Susquehanna River coming all the way down. There was no Chesapeake Bay. What caused it, and rather at that time, the forests were not what we're familiar with. There was boreal forest of spruce and other species. There were caribou, muskox walking over the lands here along with those mammoth and mastodon. And there were people, the evidence of them, many of them have been found here on the eastern shore. This is Clovis Points around 10,000 years ago or so. Darren Lowry from the eastern shore has found many, many hundreds of these eroding out of the river, the Chesapeake Bay shoreline. But the big event that really changed things started about 12,000, 11,000 years ago. And that was a very significant warming phase, as you see right here. A huge increase in temperatures at a very rapid rate that caused the ice sheets that covered much of North America and the Asian and European continent to suddenly melt. As that occurred, the forest quickly responded. We eventually had the pine and oak forest that we're used to today that came to these shores. Also, the animal populations. No more muskox around here at 8,000 years ago or so. And the rivers that was the Susquehanna, that dashed line down the center there, quickly filled with water as the sea levels quickly rose. This is a good graph that shows, it's still fairly good date about the rapid rise of sea level as the ice ages ended. And where that arrow is an inflection point where it began to sort of slow down a little bit. And that apparently allowed many of the species, especially things like oysters, to catch hold and really become abundant in the Chesapeake. And the reason we can say that is the oldest human evidence for using Chesapeake Bay resources is about 5,000 years ago, 5,000 to 6,000. And those are in the form of oyster shell middens, where they had been consuming the oysters and discarding those shells. Native Americans became intimately familiar with the nature of the Chesapeake Bay and its resources. This is a lovely 1585 painting by the artist John White of North Carolina, but it shows some of the fishing methods that the native peoples used and a few of the species that were out there. And I always loved some of the stories of the fish that were here. Sturgeon that were 11, 12, 13, even 14 foot long, could weigh 600 to 700 pounds. How, I ask you, could a Native American catch with bone tools and stone tools a fish of that size and strength? Well, John Smith, one of the early explorers, gives us a great story. Sturgeon had the habit of sleeping in the middle of the day on the surface of the water. And the Native Americans learned of that habit, and they would sneak up silently behind the sturgeon with a canoe, loop a rope around its tail, and the other end of that rope was tied to a young Indian boy. When the sturgeon awoke, you had Native American water skiing, or at least an equivalent like it, that he would be pulled through the water until the fish tired out. Then they could saddle up, row up to it, bust the thing in the head or something, knock it out, bring it ashore, and you had 500 pounds of meat. A very innovative way of capturing large fish. So the Native Americans also, though, knew about the land. Their knowledge of nature was remarkable. They also hunted, they knew plants, they knew especially the habits of animals such as deer, and we have references to them being able, with a deer skin, being able to stalk and come as close as I am to the front row and to Dr. Thompson there, imitating deer behavior so that they could readily kill it. No, very few people today have that kind of knowledge. They also did something to the environment. Their numbers were small in comparison to today, but they did modify the environment and were increasingly understanding that the use of fire, which started at least 6,000 years ago on a regular basis in this area, was intentionally performed by the native peoples. The purpose, in part, was to clear the forest floor of debris so that it could be easier travel, but it was also to drive deer, and ecologically, quite significantly, it created more food for deer, which was one of the most important animals in their diet. So the forests that are here, were here before any European stepped ashore, were not pristine. They were modified by human use of fire. Agriculture did not reach this area until about 1,000 years ago. There's some question, but around 900 AD or so, we see the first evidence for corn and beans and squash coming into this zone. And the Native Americans grew it very effectively. This is a European portrait of the native peoples in another part of America, but I love it because it's showing them using hoes, which was the tool of agriculture here. But notice this painting. What are these long lines that you see here? Those are plow lines. But where's the plow? There was no plow. The European artist could not imagine agriculture without plows and such. So he gave us a nice painting of Native American agriculture, but with the plow lines in place. So I love that cultural juxtaposition. But the native peoples learned very quickly how to girdle trees to kill them that would allow the sunlight to reach the ground where they could work up the soil, and small patches were planted in the corn and beans and squash. And they weren't regular fields, they were very irregular. Probably 1% perhaps of the land of all the Chesapeake was in agriculture at any one time during the prehistoric time period. So a very modest proportion of the soil. Native peoples did live in villages, and they grew in time. They were sometimes small. Later in the 1080, 1400, 1500, they became somewhat larger. But the population of native peoples in the Chesapeake itself was never very big. The best estimates are around 30,000 at the time of the arrival of the Jamestown colonists. And Chesapeake watershed, the entire watershed, maybe 100,000 people. Of course, those numbers rapidly declined due to disease and other factors. When the Europeans arrived, they confronted a landscape that was radically different than any that they had seen before. In Maryland, of course, in 1634, Virginia, down a little bit earlier in time, you had interaction between native peoples and the colonists that was direct and important. But the Europeans came from a land that had been under agriculture and with livestock for 6,000 to 7,000 years. Totally modified. Much of the forest had been depleted or cut over. And they arrived on these shores in a land, to them, was absolutely astonishing. It was filled with trees, with food, with birds, with everything that they could imagine. And there were trees that they served that unlike anything that existed in England. Chestnuts that were 10, 12, 15, 18, 25 feet in diameter and could soar as high as 120 feet in the air. Sometimes they've been called the sequoias of the East. Massive, massive forests that were here. And from those centers at Jamestown and St. Mary's City, European settlers began to spread out. But they had a problem of how do we make a living in this land? Well, they quickly discovered that tobacco was the way to make a profit here. But in a forested land, how do you grow tobacco? And what do you even eat? In this case, the Native Americans were absolutely vital, and we need to give intense credit to the Native peoples. Maize or corn, the beans and squash, the knowledge of wild plants, all of that was crucial for these colonies to survive. But they also gave them a very important tool in how to farm in a forested landscape. This is directly taken from Native American practice, where the trees would be girdled, about a 6 or 8 inch band all the way around. The bark would come off. That would kill the tree. Its leaves and limbs would fall. They would then apply fire to burn off the understory, releasing the nutrients that had been grown up from the leaf litter and other things on the ground. Work that up with a hoe between all the stumps and the tree roots. Plant the tobacco or the corn in hills, and then they could successfully gain wonderful tobacco crops and corn and beans and squash. But only for about 5 years. Around 5 years of time, a piece of land, 1 acre, let's say, of land could be intensively farmed. Each servant was responsible for roughly 10,000 individual plants. But after 5 years, the soil fertility and probably the frequency of nematodes and other parasites was a big factor here too. The land gave out for tobacco. They could get another year or two of corn production out of it, and then it was really hard to do much with it. So what do? You walk away from it and let it go and clear new forest, because the forest is everywhere around you. European settlers, visitors coming over here, saw these abandoned fields. And they said, these colonists are the laziest bunch of people. Look at those fields. They don't even fertilize them or manure them. Well, what those observers did not understand is that what those colonists were copying was a remarkably sustainable style of agriculture. Over about 20 years of time, nature would do its work. The fertility of that soil would be fully restored. And the colonists could come back after about 2 decades, girdle the smaller trees, burn the ground, and again get about 5 years of tobacco and 2 or 3 years of corn production off of that same piece of earth. This was shifting field agriculture, where you would abandon it. And the advantage of it, in one way, for the environment is that what it created was a patchwork of open fields, of abandoned fields, of uncut forest, or forest that was going up anew. Very little of this land was therefore open to intense erosion. And even the method that the Indians implied or used of planting the corn, or the tobacco, as you will, in little hills created a fascinating topography. And I've actually observed this when we've done it at St. Mary's City. And what those minor little hills and valleys do is every time you get an intense rain, it encourages the water to soak into the ground, not run off and wash away the soil. So this was, as a consequence of all of this, the agrarian method that was used by the colonists living in their little plantations had virtually no sedimentation impact on the Chesapeake Bay in the 17th century. And they did live right along the water. We're pretty sure of that. This is a marvelous 1670s map by Augustine Hermann, a very notable cartographer in early Maryland. And I've highlighted in red the houses. And you see the pattern here. Every one of those houses is right on the shoreline. There is no interior settlement, really, in 1670, except if there's a river or a creek that goes by it. So this gives us a really good sense of where people are living in those early years. And the reason is that the Chesapeake Bay itself proved to be such a marvelous water highway that ships right from the Rotterdam or Amsterdam or from London or Bristol could tie right up at every planter's door practically, purchase their tobacco, sell them the goods that were needed. So you didn't need towns except for government business, and this provided a way of really dispersed settlement, but it allowed the planters to very effectively engage directly with merchants. But how were these planters, these men and women who came here often as servants or as young settlers, how did they use the Chesapeake Bay? How did they use the resources that were available in this land? History tells us a little bit about that. But the best source for some of these issues is the record that they left in the soil, the archaeological record. And for that, we have been studying many years, such as at St. Mary's City. We've just celebrated 40 years of continuous archaeological research there. And us and other people around the state and Virginia have developed a very large database of over 80 sites now that can tell us about nature of the diet. Some of it's food. We find corn cobs or peach seeds or other things that tell us about the vegetable diet. But we also, from these sites, can find things that are about the meat diet, the animals that they're using that don't show up very often in the records. This is a site called St. John's, 1638, that yielded wonderful archaeological remains, often in pits, such as this. These are little time capsules that are filled up undisturbed until the archaeologist comes along hundreds of years later and retrieves those objects. And so from them, by looking at a series of these sealed time capsules, we can actually look at and reconstruct how the diet changed over time. In the earliest pits, 1620s, 30s, 40s, 50s time frames, you find animal bones from a variety of species, especially a lot of wild animals. This is from that one pit we just looked at, and we even got fish scales from 1640s, 50s still preserved. What were the animals they were eating? Well, surprisingly, cattle. Beef was the most important food. And these were European animals introduced here, and what the colonists did not care for them. They simply used a method that was a very old method in England, let the livestock run wild through the woods and feed themselves. A very simple way of livestock husbandry. They did the same thing with another beast, and this is one of those. Look at the tusk on that baby. The pigs of the 17th century were not like Porky Pig we think of today. They were pretty fierce critters. In fact, they thrived in this forested environment of the Chesapeake, and one colonist actually described them like vermin of the earth. There's so many of them running through the forest as you travel. So pork was very significant. But one animal that was an import that didn't do very well here, in fact didn't do well at all in the early years, was sheep. Sheep was a very important part of the English diet as it was in Europe, but there was a problem in a forested environment. You don't have a lot of grass, first of all, but something else in Maryland made sheep difficult. The wolf. The predators were very serious, and until wolves were eliminated, it was very challenging to successfully raise sheep because they're a very docile animal, and they tend to clump together, which is great for the wolf if it's trying to catch them. In substitute, the planters turned to what in England was a royal or an aristocratic food, venison, the white-tailed deer. This really became sort of the substitute sheep for the Maryland colonists. And unlike England, the most poor, humble, indentured servant or even an enslaved African could consume such royal meat in Maryland or Virginia. They also consumed animals such as raccoon, squirrels, opossum. But I always wonder when these colonists get off the boat, these new young indentured servants, 17, 18 years old, I often wonder, I wish I had a little time machine to go back and wonder if they were warned or if they were allowed to discover on their own certain things about the Chesapeake environment, such as what would be their first encounter with this. There's no record to tell us exactly what that was, but I'm sure it was a notable event in their lives. From the forest, there were descriptions of hundreds of turkeys in flocks. There was also quail and other birds, and unfortunately the extinct passenger pigeon was eaten here in the Chesapeake Bay. From the waters and the marshes of the Chesapeake, they fouled with firearms to hunt various waterfowl of different kinds. And it's interesting, some of those waterfowl you see in the earliest sites, such as coots, and then you never see them again on any archaeological site. I think the reason is that coot is not very good. Instead, you see animals like the redhead, the mallard, the canvasback, the teal, various things. Again, they're learning the environment, learning what is out there. So we see a lot of evidence of hunting of various types of birds in the Chesapeake. And there's some great descriptions of the sheer abundance. This is an Eastern Shore description from 1679 by a couple of travelers. But if you read that, the vibration of the air, like a storm or resembling thunder from this mass of birds arising above the landscape. I mean, it's almost unfathomable what that would have been like to experience. And yet this was a common occurrence in the fall and spring during the migration on the Chesapeake Bay. The waters of the Chesapeake Bay, archaeology shows us, were not neglected. They ate crabs. These are around 1640 from St. Mary's City. Crabs were certainly on the diet, as were sturgeon, especially on the James River, where they were more abundant than on the Potomac. But we also find many examples of fish such as this that leave. This is the jawbone of a big, about 150-pound fish called a black drum. Black drum and red drum were consumed quite often here in the Chesapeake. But what was the most popular fish on the menu in 17th century Maryland? It's a fish that regrettably is pretty much extinct in the Chesapeake Bay today. It's one you may never have heard of, but it was called, its bones look like this, and it was called the sheep's head. The sheep's head at one time were an extremely common fish. In fact, I found a visitor in 1675 in his diary noted that he had observed fishing for these. And he wrote that a planter may often take 12 to 14 in an hour's time. Now, if they average around 5 pounds each, that's 100 pounds of meat in an hour's time of fishing. You won't find that in the Chesapeake Bay today, unfortunately. But sheep's head were very significant. But what's interesting, though, is where are the bluefish? Where's the shad? Where's the herring? Where's the sea trout? Where's all those other species that have been very common in the Chesapeake? Were they not there in the 17th century? I think the answer is that they were there. But the way you get at that is looking at another source of insight, and that is the documentary record. Inventories. When somebody died, they would go through and inventory all their possessions. And this is a great source of insight into the nature of daily life for people in the past. I've gone through nearly 1,000 inventories from Maryland in the 17th century and a smaller number from Virginia. And of those inventories that have fishing equipment, 98% of them have this piece of high technology. It's actually a line with a hook and a rock or a lead weight. And the way you do it, my grandfather actually taught me how to fish this. You bait the hook, of course. You stand on the shoreline with the rope. You swing it up and let the baby fly. And it goes out to the end of the line, hits the water, and where does it go? Right to the bottom. What the technology is doing is selecting for fish species that feed along the incredibly rich bottom habitat of the Chesapeake, where all the oysters, the clams, the mollusks, a lot of the little shrimp all live. So what we're seeing is we have to understand the technology to understand the nature of the archaeological record. But clearly the sheep's head and drum and all those were a very, very important part of it. But we can see then that the colonists were using the resources of the land and water, but they very likely, because of small numbers and the approach they took, had no impact at all on the landscape or the ecology of Maryland. And their little plantations huddled along the shorelines, they were simply living very close to nature and in a way that was actually rather sustainable. As we reach the end of the 17th century and go into the 18th, after 1700, we see things begin to change more rapidly. Population begins to grow, but we also see the social changes, the landed gentry, the sons and grandsons of the earlier settlers begin to have huge estates. They build grand plantation houses that dot the shorelines of Maryland and Virginia. But another very significant change is that we see a shift from indentured servants to enslaved Africans being the primary source of the laborers who do the work on these plantations. Socially, a massive shift in the nature of Maryland and Virginia at this time period. But we also see changes going on in the nature of food and the diet and the land. The animal bones from this late time period have a very different character from those from the earlier decades. Domestic animals are still very significant. Pig is eaten, but cattle rise even more significantly. And finally, sheep start beginning to show up because the wolves have been largely eliminated in the lower areas. Deer are still consumed occasionally, but not nearly as much as they were in the early years. In fact, if I take the wild food, the wild meat content that we can estimate from pits and chart them out over time, this is what you see. You see the early 1610 here to about 1640 there. You see all kinds of wild food being used in those early decades. But around 1700, we almost get a flat line. And it means that wild things are eaten, but they're pretty much variety foods. They're no longer this crucial part of the diet of the colonist. And that goes for wild animals like deer and things, but also fish. They're still there. Drum are still being caught. But archaeological sites from the 18th century for the first time show bluefish. They show shad and herring. And the reason they're showing up is most likely because especially the rich planters have the money to afford large seines, which will allow them to collect a much broader group of the animals, of the fish that are out there. And we even have historical documents that things like herring are being specifically targeted for harvesting. They're barreled and they're used as rations for enslaved Africans. So they are harvesting different resources there. But this is a chart from my dissertation, and I think you get a sense, just to show you the three time frames, look at the percentage of fish bone in the earlier years, 35%, 18th century sites, 4.5. That is a statistically significant change, let me tell you. It really is a big shift. So how they're using resources are changing. The other thing that's going on after 1700 is settlement is beginning to leave the coastal plain and they're going into the Piedmont, a very different landscape than the coastal areas. The Piedmont is much more hilly. It's a lot different soil nature. And as they settle there, they're going in, they're using these methods of agriculture, but they're also cutting down trees, they're clearing things. And because it's so much more steeply, topography is so much steeper, you're getting a much quicker degradation of the soil. In fact, there's a reference to an old settler who said that he had observed that after about 25 years of new settlement, somebody coming in, the topsoil in the Piedmont was almost washed away due to the agricultural methods that they were using up there. So that is putting nutrients into the waters flowing into the Chesapeake Bay. Most of the sediment probably just clogged up the creeks and the freshwater streams, but some of those nutrients clearly reach down further into the bay itself. The big story, though, is the population increase. This is a general chart of roughly the population of the colonists in the Chesapeake region through time. And as population grows, you get a couple of things happening. One of the things is, as the land is limited, so in older studied areas, land prices become higher. But also, when you get too many people in this area, that old system of shifting fields where you could allow 20 years of time for the land to restore itself naturally, they no longer could do that. They had to get more money out of a piece of land. And what they did is after, well, it's in sometime in the 1730s, 40s, but particularly after 1750, they shifted from tobacco to grain production, or at least a larger proportion of wheat production. And wheat, you can grow a little bit of it with a hoe, but it's one heck of a lot more effective if you have a plow. So we see a technological change associated with the shift. And plows become a very different tool. And unlike a hoe, a plow really disturbs the soil in ways that would be not, wasn't found in the 17th century. Rich planters like George Washington shifted to a big time to wheat, but even poor people, tenants, small farmers, also made this shift because of economy and because of other issues. There was some tobacco still grown, but wheat became a biggie. And we can tell this by the work of historians such as Lorena Walsh, who found in Charles County, Maryland, that before the American Revolution, only about 21% of the tenants owned plows. But after the American Revolution, it exploded. Nearly 3/4 of the tenants had plow in their estate, meaning that a much larger part of the land was in agriculture each year. A historian, Ed Farmer, has made a study and suggesting that around 1720, 2% of the land in southern Maryland was in annual agricultural production. By 1800, just 80 years later, 40% was yearly used for crops. This had a huge impact on the Chesapeake Bay. Those fields were wide open for erosion of the soil, but also the forest began to disappear. And this had an impact on livestock, for example. Cattle and pigs that had roamed through the forest feeding themselves no longer could do that. They were set loose in the fields to glean what they could. And Joanne Bowen, an archaeozoologist at Colonial Williamsburg, has found a very interesting pattern that the animal bones in the 17th century tend to be much larger than the English, but around 1700, 1720, the animals tend to become smaller. Cattle especially become smaller in size, probably because they are being put into the fields instead of the old forest where they used to flourish. So there's some real changes going on during this time period. But the big one for us, probably most significant, is what agriculture does to the soil. It washes it off when intense rains allow this open, exposed area to erode right into the rivers of the Chesapeake Bay. We find very quickly that ports such as Port Tobacco, Mattawaman, Piscataway Creek up here on the Potomac River, some of the Eastern Shore areas, Joppatown up here, even the Port of Baltimore, begin to silt up. Those that had been available to ocean-going vessels in 1775 were no longer accessible in 1820. Intense erosion is filling up these estuaries. Baltimore Harbor had to start dredging by 1790, for example. We know this not only from history, but also from the work of our geological colleagues who take sediment cores. And Grace Brush, Dr. Grace Brush of Johns Hopkins University, was really one of the leaders in this. And she was able to take core samples from a variety of sites around the Chesapeake. And what she found, they use radiocarbon to date some of these as well as pollen. And what she found is that this is 0 AD, 500, 1,000, 1,500, roughly the arrival of the settlers here. The annual amount of erosion or sedimentation going into that core is fairly minimal. But after 1700, especially as you get around 1800, the erosion and sedimentation rate tremendously increases. Declines a little around 1850, but then as you get into the 20th century, massive quantities of silt is being washed into the Chesapeake Bay. That is really the first major consequence of human action on the bay resources. Now, the Chesapeake has always had erosion. The Chesapeake was formed by sea level rise and the shoreline eroding away. But a lot of that is sand and gravel. It's not all really rich topsoil. The agricultural practices of the late 18th and into the 19th century that left huge areas of land exposed to rain washed off the most nutrient-rich topsoil. And that is what really allowed these chemicals, especially nitrogen and phosphates, into the waters of the Chesapeake and began nutrification, enrichment of the waterways over what they had been previously. At the same time, we have cities beginning to develop. Baltimore, Richmond, Norfolk begin to grow up on the Chesapeake Bay. These are markets for seafood, but they're also sources of something we don't like to talk about, sewage, okay? So you have another integration there. Dams increasingly are being built in the 19th century, which cut off many species of fish that spawned in the upper streams of the Chesapeake Bay. But the real shifts that we start seeing, I think the significance of them is related to technology. Steam power, first in steamboats, begins to make more dependable transportation on the bay available for the first time. If you're in a sailing boat and you've got a hull full of crabs or fish and the wind dies for 2 days or 3 days, what do you do with those crabs and fish? You find a real sucker to sell them to is what you do, or you throw them out. This allowed marketing much more effectively. But the real shift, I think the most significant one, is the application of steam power to land transportation. Once railroads began in the 1840s, 1850s, you really began to find for the first time big markets, New York, Philadelphia, could be supplied regularly with seafood. And even more important, in 1870, a patent was discovered for something that's very significant, the first refrigerated rail car. When you get refrigerated cars, you can ship stuff like crabs long distances without them going bad. This opened up seafood markets for the first time in a major way for the people, the fishermen who lived, and women, the watermen along the Chesapeake Bay. Harvesting increased intensely. Massive numbers of fish were taken. Here on the eastern shore, as well as elsewhere in the Chesapeake Bay, the largest commercial hunting enterprise in the world occurred between about 1870 and about 1900. Millions and millions of geese and ducks and other waterfowl were killed and shipped to markets not only to Philadelphia or New York, but to elegant restaurants in London or in Paris. Men with cannons, basically, on ships would go out and could kill 100 ducks in a single blow. This had a devastating impact and reduced, in fact, by 1912, they finally started putting limits on this commercial hunting. But the real prize, the real gold, if you will, in the Chesapeake Bay was the oyster. Oysters had been here for thousands of years, as I've said. As late as the Civil War, oyster beds were so thick that at low tide, many times they were exposed and were navigational hazards. Crewmen on the USS Monitor, when they were actually anchored in the James River after the famous encounter with the Merrimack, or the Virginia, as I prefer to call it, were eating oysters that they could see right off their boat. This no longer happens, of course. And the reason is because for years, oysters were captured by hand with little rakes from the seashore or with tongs, a device introduced around 1700 here. But in 1865, something new came in, another piece of technology, the Oyster Dredge. And for the first time, that opened up deeper water and very inaccessible areas to oystering. This created an absolute boom in the Chesapeake Bay region. Over this era, or in mid-19th century, canning also became very much more reliable as a technology, and oysters began to be packaged. Chesapeake Bay oysters were worldwide famous. They were shipped everywhere around this planet because of their reputation. But the problem was that it also created great competition. And some of you may have heard of the Oyster Wars that occurred on the Chesapeake Bay. Well, we think of the Wild West, but let me tell you, Crisfield was as bawdy, as rowdy, and as violent as any gold mining town in the West when the Oyster Wars broke out, because there was immense amounts of money to be made. And make it they did. They harvested tremendous amounts of oysters. In fact, there were some years where millions of bushels, 12 million bushels a year, were taken out of the Chesapeake Bay. From 1860 to 1980, about 98% of our oysters were removed. Today, less than 1% survive over what they were at the time of the American Civil War. That was a linchpin in the entire ecosystem of the Chesapeake Bay. We see eutrophication from the agrarian culture practices that people had. We also see the oysters and other fish being harvested intensely. But how did these animals respond to these changes caused by humans? How did oysters, for example, respond to these sediments and nutrients that were coming down to them? Did they just die, or did they respond in some way? Unfortunately, we do not have scientific evidence going back to the 1800s or the 1700s or the 1600s. But I submit to you that there's one way that we can get some clue as to how wildlife and the biota was responding. And that is from the animals that lived on the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, most particularly the oyster that comes from archaeological context. By dating oysters, we can have a timed sample, and by carefully studying the nature of those shells, how quickly they grew in places. And right now we have two great examples of long-term 500-year series from the Tuxant River and from St. Mary's City area of oyster shell. We can look at them, we can measure their width, their growth, their annual productivity, and gain a sense. And I'm going to show you right now a graph that we published a few years ago. This is samples of oysters from the Patuxent River, the lower Patuxent, and the St. Mary's River. That's kind of complicated, going from 1500 to around 2002. But we see during the long time period when hoe agriculture was the primary method and there was vast tree cover in the area, oysters grew around 24, 25 millimeters per year. During that period of enrichment, when all the agricultural plowing occurs, those oysters were responding, not by dying, but by growing more quickly. They were consuming the immense amount of new food that was producing phytoplankton growth in the Chesapeake. So they're responding favorably to it. But then we get over-harvesting. They decline significantly from that peak during this era. And in the 20th century, we see that St. Mary's has recovered a little bit because it was mostly reforested. Patuxent River is continuing to go downhill in terms of oyster growth. So the animals were responding. But what happened is that this Chesapeake Bay from 5,000 or 6,000 years ago up until probably the 1890s or 1900s was a system that primarily had phytoplankton and filter feeders, both oysters and finfish like menhaden and herring and shad that were eating the food that was produced by the nutrients that were available. Studies have suggested that in the 17th century, oysters could totally filter every drop of water in the Chesapeake Bay in about 2.5 days. Every drop of water. Today, it would take about 2.5 to 3 years for that to occur. Oysters were a vital part of this process. Today, we don't have filter feeders like that. We have a system that is dominated by algae from all the nutrients that are being put into the water. And when they die, it's a bacterial system on the bottom. And those bacteria are what suck the oxygen out of the water, creating dead zones, basically, of oxygen-depleted waters in increasingly large areas of the Chesapeake Bay. So the whole trophic structure of the Chesapeake has changed since the late 19th century. And this is very clear with grasses in the water that was critical for fish. The algae growth hides these, they can't get sunlight, they die, further creating a problem. So the Chesapeake Bay was the most productive estuary in the entire world. It was used by humans for thousands of years. Native Americans successfully learned its secrets and were able to gain their livelihood from it. And when those first English colonists stepped ashore, I would like to correct the record because things didn't all of a sudden go to hell because the English arrived. Some people think that. No. As long as they followed that sustainable agricultural method that the Native Americans had and the populations were low, they had no impact at all on the Chesapeake Bay. Hoes and forest clearance were not a big issue. It's only when plows came into use and we have that technological change to animal power that we start seeing a real degradation. But it's really the steam power and the oystering that really were drove the last nail in the coffin, if you will, because those filter feeders, those oysters were absolutely crucial to eat the food that the nutrients were creating and to maintain the purity and the nature of the Chesapeake Bay. The other thing that's happened, of course, is population growth. This shows you just how huge the population has become on the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. And I've got to update this. The last one is about 13 million. There's now over 14 million people in the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a real problem. In addition, all the hardscape, the parking lots, the roofs, the lack of trees, the lack of water that can percolate into the soil is doing more and more to push nutrients and pollutant into the water itself. So the Chesapeake Bay is a real issue. What do we need to do? There's a lot of debate about that. But I would argue that we have to try to reduce the sediment and the nutrients that are going into it. then we need to try to restore those vital filter feeders. Even today, the last filter feeder that's active in the Chesapeake Menhaden are still being actively harvested by the millions. They're a vital part, but also to restore the oysters if we can, and really give the bay a rest. We've taken a little bit too much out of it. We've taken from the bay freely, and freedom is our birthright. We certainly need to defend that today as much as ever. But freedom also has obligations. And that obligation is to take the things that we've been given and pass them on in a state that they're worth getting. For the Chesapeake Bay, we all need to have the courage and the willingness to sacrifice and to make the hard decisions so that the people that aren't yet born, our posterity, will have a little glimpse of the Chesapeake Bay and the abundant and fruitful land that Maryland's first settlers found when they first arrived on these majestic shores. I thank you.